welcome to What the Plus, a critical overview of the last century of pop culture as filtered through one specific streaming service owned by Disney called Disney Plus. I am Garrett Martin, and this episode's a long one. I'm not going to beat around the bush with some unnecessary intro. I'm just going to get right into the conversation. This week, my guest is Henry Gilbert, co-host of the Talking Simpsons podcast and the What a Cartoon podcast. He picked a old Spider-Man cartoon from the early 80s, not actually made by Disney, but it's on Disney Plus because they own all the Spider-Man stuff now, pretty much. So let's just get right to it. Here's me and Henry Gilbert talking about Spider-Man and his amazing friends from 1981. My guest today is Henry Gilbert, one of the hosts of Talking Simpsons and the What a Cartoon podcast. How you doing, Henry?
Why, hello. Thanks for having me, Garrett.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's awesome to talk to you. Your shows are really popular.
Thanks.
Did you ever imagine that you would make a living hosting internet radio shows about The Simpsons or other old cartoons?
No, certainly not. It was what I was obsessed with in childhood, like old cartoons of any kind, and watching The Simpsons every single chance I could. My family taped every episode from day one, but I never thought it would lead to a job. But as I found out working in the games press, which is where I first met you, I've learned, you know what I really love is doing the podcasts around video games. I was able to transition into just full-time podcasting. It's been pretty great.
Yeah, you and your co-host Bob Mackey, you guys do a great job, and it's you've seen the results. People love the show, so congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you.
Now, speaking of The Simpsons, I'm pretty sure we're both the age. I'm a little bit older than you, but we're both the age where The Simpsons is basically the cream of the crop when it comes to TV, both as entertainment and in terms of its cultural relevance. Now, I've seen younger people who grew up with the later seasons, or maybe who just have never watched it. They tend to dismiss it. Sometimes they mock old white guys for loving it so much. So beyond our nostalgia and the show's popularity and the fact that those first few seasons are still some of the best comedy writing you'll ever see on TV, what relevance do you think a modern audience can find in The Simpsons today?
Oh, boy. Well, I definitely, when I see on Disney Plus, and who knows how much they fabricate those numbers, but it's always in their top trending things. So I definitely think it still matters to people. But to the degree now, I think it really has been the last 5 years as a meme, just as Simpsons as mimetic language is really its biggest impact these days.
I mean, there are probably people who only know of The Simpsons because of the Aurora Borealis memes, right?
Yeah, exactly. People would get people I'd say under 20. I would bet certainly were introduced to Simpsons by the steamed ham memes or the lesser meme, like the Homer going into the bush meme from season 5. It's just Grandpa
walking in and immediately out of the brothel when he sees a Bart sitting there.
So many just perfect ones, and I always love when a new one becomes a meme, like the one of Homer kicking in the door and warning Bart about the boogeyman. Whenever a new one comes around, I'm like, that's so great. And I think it works because it's this rush of nostalgia from remembering something, and you unite with another person, you remember this too because we're both sharing it and laughing at it. But it also then just transcends language of just it becomes its own shorthand.
In every classic Simpsons episode has at least 12 memes within it waiting to be discovered and perpetuated online. So
yeah, whenever we cover a classic episode, we often go boy, I didn't remember how every meme came from this one.
Yeah.
Or this is 5 memes. And yeah, I think it really helped our podcast too, that I believe we launched within months of Frinkiac. It made our jobs a whole lot easier too.
Right. It kind of shares that with when you were talking about how you rewatch an old episode and you forgot how many of the gags and plots came from the same episode. It kind of shares that with another show from that era that was as important to me and my friends of the time, Seinfeld, where you'll watch a Seinfeld today and you'll be like, oh, wait, the A plot and the B plot and the C plot are all in the same episode. These are all things I remember so well, and I forgot they were all in the same episode. The Simpsons has that in the same way Seinfeld does, you know?
Yeah, the 90s shows, especially, I think thanks to Seinfeld, they all were like, we have to have B and C and D plots and all this stuff, so you end up with these, like, fairly independent stories, so you forget on The Simpsons, like, the episode with Frank Grimes is the one where Bart is buys an old factory and him and Milhouse are guarding it. Like, and then only when you watch it, you're like, oh right, the Homer's auto dialer was in the same episode where Lisa and Nelson start dating. That's how random.
All right, so you've watched every episode, I'm assuming, of The Simpsons.
Well, I mean, to a point, I did drop off in 13 or 14 and check in every now and then. So I watched those first 13 or 14 years religiously, and I will be honest that I have not watched every single episode of Simpsons ever. But like, and the more they produce them, the more my percentage of watched episodes goes down.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I haven't really watched probably half a dozen episodes in the last, honestly, 18 years or so. Was there a specific episode where you checked out of watching every week where you're like, I just can't do it anymore?
Oh boy, man, this is a question we come to many times on the show, especially as we're about to start talking about season 12. But I think it was a series of it was Death by a Thousand Cuts, because it came with like several episodes that I just thought, well, that's not as funny in season 10 or 11. And then came like the death of Maude, and then came the Kid Rock episode, and then came the NSYNC episode. And I think it really, that just wore me out by the end of season 12. And then when I came into season 13 with the Treehouse of Horror, and it had like, it was something about them having a Harry Potter parody in that episode when Harry Potter was like brand new and was just getting its first movie. I just thought, man, this is for kids now. I can't do this anymore. That was really when I just fell off. But I check in every now and then. I mean, it also coincided with I started college that year. And It was the 2001, so a lot of changes were happening.
So I might have seen it. I didn't even know there was a Kid Rock episode. I mean, obviously every popular celebrity eventually winds up on The Simpsons, but like when you said, oh, the Kid Rock episode, I have absolutely no idea what that means. So.
Yeah, in season 11, they do a spring break episode that is a parody of the late 90s MTV spring break stuff. And Kid Rock performs in it, and he plays himself, and the late Joe C. is in it as well. And the biggest issue I have with it, not only is that, like, obviously I hate Kid Rock and think he sucks, but also they turn Homer into, like, a boozy party monster, which and even on the commentary they admit, like, what are we doing? Like, we wrote this too quickly. This is very first draft, and we just shoved it out because it was late in the season.
Right. Man, the episode that I remember being like, you know what, I'm done with this show. I don't have any idea what season it was. I don't remember what year it came out, but it's the one with the flashback where they suddenly establish after like 12 years or whatever that Homer and Moe and Lenny and Carl were all friends in middle school or something like that.
Yes, yeah. No, that's in the coming years for our show. I think it's like 14 or 15. Yeah, when they fully Muppet Babies-ify them, that was a big move on their part.
Yeah, no, that was a terrible episode, and I was already not watching it like regularly at that point, but I would still sometimes tune in, and that was sort of the breaking point for me. So of the episodes you have seen, then, getting back to my original line of questioning, what would you consider to be the most underrated Simpsons episode?
Boy, that's a good one. It's tough because I think if you name one from the classic years, which I think most people would say is 3 to 8, 3 to 7, depending on your opinion, like it's really hard to say. I do think in season, I would never call it my favorite episode, but I do think it's the funniest, and I think people might overlook it a little bit, is season 6, Homie the Clown, which is the one where Homer becomes Krusty, and or becomes a regional Krusty. And that one is so funny. It has just joke every second. And it's one of the last ones, the classic ones, directed by David Silverman, who is if any one person defined the look of television Simpsons, it's David Silverman. And it was it's the last one I think he could really go for it in that one. But because it's not like a very heartfelt one, I think it's not one everybody super duper remembers.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just me, but I definitely remember the conclusion with Homer having to do the trick through the loop-de-loop or whatever.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the meme with my friends, like I've been saying forever, is like, I'm seeing double here. 4 blank.
Exactly. What would you think is the most overrated?
Boy, that's, I think this is a great episode. And I think it has some of the funniest stuff ever in it because, Lisa needs braces, that whole line in it. But yeah, the one where Homer becomes the union boss, last exit out of Springfield. That for the longest time, they even say it on the commentaries. Oh, this is rated in multiple magazines, the best episode of The Simpsons, the funniest episode of The Simpsons. But when I watched it, I was like, well, it's really great, but I wouldn't even call it the best in season 4 because that has Mr. Plow in it, which is I think the best that season. But what that one is, it's just so wacky and crazy and kind of time wasty that I think it is a little overrated. Just calling it the funniest ever when I think at this point I would not put it in my top 10 actually.
I mean, you can kind of make a point when you get to that sweet spot, seasons 3 through 5, you can kind of make an argument for almost any episode being one of the 10 best episodes of the entire show,
Yeah.
They're firing off so consistently in that time period.
Yeah, my personal pick for my favorite one is probably Bart's comment, just because I think it's funny. I think it gave me a lot of views on politically as well. And on top of that, it actually has real heart of the whole town coming together. Though I think what really is the best episode, more objectively, is the first part of Who Shot Mr. Burns. That's really the Simpsons series finale movie. That's what I think of that.
Yeah. So, not to sort of change subjects, but this is a Disney Plus based podcast. How do you feel about Disney just so easily and thoroughly subsuming The Simpsons into its corporate family the way it has?
It has been bonkers to see because one, just to see that their money could really do anything. When there was talk of Disney Plus ahead of time, for a while, I was like, well, probably The Simpsons isn't going to be on there because I know how many strings they had to pull to do that Simpsons World thing on FX Now, and you had to do it through a cable subscription and had to have all these things because I knew they had all these rules with syndication and all that. And I figured, well, that's a lot of red tape to cut through. But clearly then Disney proved me wrong by spending all the money they needed to get it on Disney Plus and have it be the first actual streaming spot for The Simpsons.
And they went in and they changed the aspect ratio to get it to be the correct one after it had been up incorrectly for close to a year or so.
Yeah, I mean the whole history of that was so crazy too because the Simpsons World streaming site, which again sucked. I hated using it. I almost always just watch my DVDs for the podcast, but the FX Now started with the bad aspect ratio. A bunch of nerds on the internet complained, and they then changed it after less than a year. And then when Disney Plus started, it went back to widescreen only. I was like, you already went through this with FX Now. How do people not know on their side that you want the option for the real aspect ratio?
Are there any I know there's a long history of syndication cuts where some of the best one-off gags will get cut off for the syndicated runs of these shows. Is Disney Plus, are they all the uncut ones? Are there any like syndication cuts people have found on the service?
Not that I have heard of. There's not been any syndication. Everything seems to be the versions that were on the DVDs that were also on FX now. I'm pretty sure it's all there's. There's even times where I know they changed lines for syndication. They reverted back to the DVD version. Like there's one in the season 7 premiere where Milhouse says Pier 1, and then in the syndication they changed it to Trader Pete because they wanted to not use a real name. But then on the Disney Plus version, it's Trader Pete again, or Pier 1 again. So yeah, though there is one major change is that there's one episode they didn't put on the service, which is the Michael Jackson episode, Stark
Exactly.
Raving Dad. Yeah.
Is that available anywhere outside of the DVDs?
If you don't own the DVDs, you kind of can't get it anymore, I think. I mean, on the plus side, the season 3 DVDs, I think they made like literally 10 million of them. So, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely not on Disney Plus anymore. It got taken off of FX now, but even before that, and I believe digitally it cannot be purchased on any of the storefronts either. So yeah, it's just. It's kind of gone, which, I just feel like these things are never truly gone, especially something as famous as The Simpsons. And I absolutely understand on the production side, like both why Disney and The Simpsons producers wouldn't want to feature a Michael Jackson thing anymore on their service.
It's such an important part of the show's history, though. And he's not even billed as himself. I remember when it came out, there was serious question as to whether it was actually him or not.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I bought the DVDs too, was to hear the commentary and just hear them say out loud, like, "Hey, we're just saying it's Michael Jackson now. Forget we're no more secrets."
Right. So yeah, it's weird they would pull that one. But Disney, they are very good at hiding old stuff they don't want people to see. Mm-hmm. So now that they own The Simpsons, that thing could be gone forever. Although they brought Captain EO back, like in the theme parks after all of the controversy about him had started up. So it's weird they would later be like, "Hey, yeah, you can't see this one of 400 or so episodes of a cartoon."
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it's 700 episodes now, but yeah,
really, Jesus Christ.
But yeah, the Captain EO thing. Did you? I'm sure you watched the Imagineering doc on Plus, like the bit where they get to Captain EO, because I was glad they didn't pretend it didn't exist, because it was a major thing for 80s Imagineers. But they go like, and then Captain EO with George Lucas and a famous singer, and then we did, and it's just like straight to like Splash Mountain or Big Thunder.
Right. And although soon they'll probably want to cut the Splash Mountain part out of that documentary as well.
Yeah.
So you picked a show that's not The Simpsons. You host the most successful Simpsons podcast. The Simpsons is on Disney Plus. This is a podcast about Disney Plus, and you picked Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends.
Yeah.
Also weird. This is the first animated show or movie a guest has picked so far for the show.
Oh, wow.
And it's not made by Disney.
Yeah, this I mean, I also, on top of being a hardcore Simpsons fan, growing up I was a hardcore comic book fan, and Spider-Man has always been my favorite comic book character, and so I figure like it'd be really cool to do something with Spidey, and there's some really deep cuts on Disney Plus. That's a reason I wanted to pick this one.
Yeah, we definitely had very similar childhoods, I think, when it comes to the stuff we got really into. I was super into Marvel as a kid, more than any other company. I didn't even read DC until I was in middle school. I was just like a Marvel guy. When did you first see this series? This came out in 1981. For people who don't know, there have been multiple Spider-Man cartoons. This is a specific series that aired from 81 to 83. I forget what network. It was a Saturday morning show. When did you first see it?
I first saw it thanks to a Christmas gift I got in 1992 because I was born in 82, so I was just a baby when this aired on Saturday mornings, but Marvel Productions had started putting out VHS tapes of just singular episodes and just a couple of them. And 1992 was like the year I super got into Spider-Man comics, thanks to like Todd McFarlane and the entire comic boom. and so, you know, my mom got me a tape of one of the 3 episodes we watched, The Origin of the Spider-Friends. Because I already loved Spider-Man, and then seeing it, I was like, "Wow, moving pictures of Spider-Man!" It just amazed me. All the hokiness was I could just overlook it entirely because it was just the excitement of seeing a moving Spider-Man.
So you were super into this. I guess you saw this before you ever saw the '60s cartoon or the early '90s cartoon.
I think so. Well, yeah, because the Spider-Man animated series of the 90s, that was 94, so it was definitely before that. And then the 60s show, I think I did know the song, and maybe I'd seen a replay of it, but even as a little kid, like under 10, seeing reruns of it, I knew it looked way worse than even like He-Man did back then. And I couldn't. Now I watch those old 60s Spider-Man and I'm like, yeah, it's so wacky, it's kind of fun. But yeah.
All those 60s Marvel cartoons, yeah, they're minimally animated. I don't even know if you can use the word animation to describe them. But from an artistic standpoint, they look exactly like the comics. I mean, it looks like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko drew those, which makes them kind of fun to watch as a fan of the art. So this show, I was a little too young for it. I don't know if it aired on like the USA Saturday Morning Cartoon Express or Sunday Morning Cartoon Express, or if I like rented videotapes at some point. But I remember seeing it when I was like 10 or so, late 80s, and being really kind of confused by it because, I mean, Iceman is hanging out with Spider-Man. You've got this new character who really wasn't in the comic books. Very clearly they wanted to use the Human Torch and they couldn't.
Yes, yeah. For the same reason Herbie the robot is in the Fantastic Four cartoon from the 70s. There was some legal BS with the Human Torch TV rights belonging to somebody else. And
like watching it today, it really hammers home. I mean, we're going to talk about 3 specific episodes. Before we do, just from a larger perspective, this show really kind of hammers home how much cartoons changed in just like a decade.
Yes.
You watch this cartoon from 81, 82, and it's not very smart. It's not very funny. It's not remotely subtle or nuanced. Not saying that shows like Batman the Animated Series necessarily were, or the X-Men cartoon from the 90s, or that Spider-Man cartoon, but the 90s cartoons were way more advanced, and for obviously a slightly older, maybe more intelligent audience than this show was.
Yeah, I think if you compare this, from 81 to say the 70s DC content, there was almost no Marvel stuff in the 70s, but the DC stuff in the 70s, like Super Friends, and even more so the Filmation like Batman and Green Lantern cartoons, I do think this is clearly better than those, but everything advanced so quickly. I think a big part of this too, what's interesting about this show is that it's like one of the last shows before every 80s cartoon became just a toy commercial.
Yeah.
And so it's still more like, well, yeah, this is about the comic book heroes, and we'll tell you about them, but they're not going to like drive in vehicles that you can buy in stores or whatever.
It's also very much a Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns cartoon. I mean, I think that the grim and gritty trend of comics that really flourished throughout the late 80s into the 90s definitely, I think, had an impact on those 90s cartoons being slightly more elevated. And this show, you can tell that this is from an era of superhero entertainment that is solidly just for kids.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, to line it up with like superhero comic history, I think like the Byrne and Claremont era is just getting started when this airs. Yeah. And meanwhile, Spidey himself is like, he's in an okay place. I believe Roger Stern's about to take over Amazing. I think we're getting near issue 200 then.
Yeah.
But that was when like the nerds who grew up with the 60s comics, the Silver Age nerds, started taking over the comics, and there was getting to be more, postmodernism or meta stuff. But this
Oh yeah, the comics are absolutely like well beyond the this cartoon in terms of quality and thoughtfulness behind them at this point. I mean, this is the era of Marvel when I started to get into comics, and they were definitely going for more of like I think a middle school or teenage audience already, even in the early 80s when they were still being sold on newsstands for kids.
Yeah, which is crazy that they'd regress like that with the cartoon show, because the reason the Marvel Age of Comics began is because they could appeal beyond children with the original Kirby, Lee, and Ditko stuff.
So, I mean, watching it today, it's obviously not made for, people our age at all. That is exactly what all Saturday morning cartoons were like. I mean, you probably remember watching Saturday morning cartoons, right? I mean, they haven't been around for like 25 years now, but they used to be the biggest thing in the world for kids. So what made you want to pick the show for this podcast?
Well, one, it's super nostalgic to me, and second, I honestly wanted to talk about like the intellectual property rights, that the winding road of it that got it onto Disney Plus, because it's so strange that they have something I love when they started Disney Plus was that they just kind of gave you basically everything. These things like Bonkers, the Disney afternoon show that no one has nostalgia for. They just dump it on there. And same with here's every Spider-Man show we have. We'll just put it on there, and you can finally watch them digitally streaming.
So you picked out 3 episodes. I couldn't make the time commitment to do an entire season.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually pretty long. They're like 25 minutes each, and they feel a lot longer when you're watching them.
A lot of slow pace to it, yeah.
Let's go through the 3 episodes you picked out. You started with let's see here, 7 Little Superheroes, where the chameleon, who apparently lives in a castle for some reason, kidnaps 7 random superheroes. Really no rhyme or reason to the ones they picked out for the show. I mean, Shanna the She-Devil, I guess she was starring in the Kazara comic that was running at that time, but it seems like a really weird pick. What did you think of 7 Little Superheroes, and why did you feel like this is one we should talk about?
Well, because this one I think gives you the best feel of the first year. So this is presented on Disney Plus as one season, but it's really weirder of they did 13 episodes, then 3 episodes, then 8 episodes over 3 years. And this first season, this really sums it up, because you have a random Spider-Man villain like Chameleon just moved up in importance so he can be a bad guy to face multiple people. You have the random appearances of other Marvel superheroes, because their dream was this would be the start of a whole bunch of cartoons, and this episode would make kids go I want to see a Doctor Strange cartoon. And then thirdly, it's the fact that the main person who saves the day is their unlikable animal sidekick, Miss Lion, who is all over the show.
I will say this: I came in maybe a little predisposed to like Ms. Lion more than I would because of the really good Pet Avengers series from 10 years ago.
About that.
Which is very fun. If you've read those comics, you should read them.
Yeah, no, she's the kids who grew up with this show and loving it, they started adding them to the comics. I remember Dan Slott in his Spider-Man run, he did almost as a joke in the original version of Spider-Verse, before the movie in the comics, he did a scene where seemingly the Spider friends in their universe are all murdered, including Miss Lion. And he got so much response that he's like, okay, look, that's another universe that looks like the Amazing Friends universe, Spider Friends universe, but it's not that. I didn't kill the real Mrs. Lion.
So, this episode, all these other characters they bring in, the only one who really seems to have a purpose to be there is Namor, which I'm pretty sure is just because of the whole fire-ice dynamic with Firebird and Iceman, his water powers play into the plot. Whereas, Doctor Strange, Captain America, Shanna the She-Devil, they don't really do anything characteristic of those characters. They're just they're his bodies. I mean, at one point, Doctor Strange is like held captive in just a normal cage with bars. He's just sitting there like, oh well, I'm in a cell. I can't do anything, and you're the Sorcerer Supreme.
We're watching this time. I was like, oh my god, it's just driving me crazy. Everything they're forgetting. Like, I mean, Captain America. If they thought this was gonna make kids want to see spin-off shows with all these characters, Captain America looks like a dope who just falls into quicksand like an idiot. Like,
right.
and also, but that Doctor Strange. They need a dog to sniff out that Chameleon is posing as other people, when really Doctor Strange should have a magical hocus pocus thing to instantly know that it's Chameleon in a costume.
Yeah, he literally doesn't do anything until after he's sprung out of that cage, when the Eye of Agamotto opens up, and I don't even remember what it does, but it does something. But Namor, though, I mean, like, not only is he there, not only is it he's portrayed as the Namor from the comic, i.e. a complete dick.
Yeah, that I really like, that they knew the appeal of Namor is that he is like a regal jerk who hates everybody. Like, and I also I may be putting too much on the writing of the episode, but I did like that they say, like, and to start, Namor, which, he is the first Marvel Comics superhero.
Yeah, he is. And they have him and Captain America together, although they don't hint at at that point 40 plus years of history together.
It'd be weird if they brought in the World War II thing. There's another episode of this season where they fight the Red Skull, and it shows you how much things have changed in 40 years as well, because when they face Red Skull, they're like, well, here's just swastikas just on screen. Like, there was no question about that being weird to put in a kid's cartoon.
So you've seen the whole series. Is there any cameo weirder than Shanna the She-Devil?
I do think she is the strangest, and I don't understand why it's her and not, one of many. So, like, Miss Marvel, like, she's still doing stuff in 81, or they just had a Spider-Woman series. Get her on, but they. Shanna the She-Devil is the weirdest pick in there. I mean, they do get some Daredevil and you get some Thor in there. I mean, it was wacky to see Thor and Iron Man back then. Like, watching these episodes too reminded me of, like, when these characters in the 90s, when I got into the Marvel Comics, of the core Avengers were losers compared to X-Men and Spider-Man.
Which I hated. When I was a kid, when I was a huge Marvel fan in the 80s, those were my favorite characters. Captain America, Iron Man. I loved the Avengers comics. West Coast Avengers was my favorite comic when I was like 8 or whatever. And I resented how popular the X-Men were. I always liked Spider-Man. Never any problems with Spider-Man. But by the 90s, when the X-Men just completely took the entire company over, man, that really annoyed me. And none of my friends liked the comics I liked. They'd make fun of me for reading Captain America.
Well, I mean, in that Captain America run, and you definitely get the sense of him in this episode, is like Cap came off as your grandpa coming in to give you a lecture. Like, when he'd guest star in other comics, he'd be like, now, Spider-Man, you should have called me first.
See, that's the thing. I feel like if people ever actually read the Captain America comics, like when people were really surprised at how the Marvel Cinematic Universe Captain America was, not like some big right-wing jerk, but was more sort of like classic American progressive liberal ideals or whatever. If you ever read the comic, you would know that. I mean, this guy quit being Captain America in the 70s. Because he couldn't work for a government he didn't believe in anymore.
I love that comic that all but says President Nixon is the head of the Serpent Society, and then he kills himself. Like, that was insane. They did that.
Yeah, man. Geez, that was a really good comic, and we need comics like that today. They probably exist. I can't afford to read comics anymore, so I have no idea what's happening in any of them.
No, I felt I was a weekly reader of comics for such a long time until I think it was about 5 years ago is when I just was like, I just can't keep up anymore. Plus, Marvel just was addicted to doing new number ones, so I was just like, nah, I can't. I still read a lot of, adult comics. I'm not as much of a superhero guy now.
Yeah, no, I gave up superheroes probably a decade ago. And really, when I stopped reading comics from like the 90s through the early aughts and didn't really get back into it until 2005 or so. And although I read a lot of new stuff and a lot of, like you said, adult comics, graphic novels, stuff like that, uh, when it came to superheroes, my favorite thing was buying those huge black and white telephone books of like old 70s series that I never read when I was a kid, and, reading those for weeks on end.
Now, when as I got older, that's when I started to really appreciate the comics of before I was born. Like I just read them as too hokey in my childhood, and then it was only in my 20s when I'd always heard, oh, Jack Kirby, the king of comics. I was like, if you'd asked me in the 90s, I'd be like, oh yeah, I mean, his stuff's good, sure. And then only as I matured could I go like, oh no, this guy invented everything. Like he's maybe the most important, at least American comic book artist there ever was.
Absolutely. And when you look at his influence on movies, on toys, like he goes beyond just superhero comics. He is one of the most influential creators in my mind of the 20th century, at least when it comes to American pop culture. And I say that as a guy who is just hopelessly a nerd about him. So if that sounds ridiculous, that's probably why.
But by the way, another fun fact about cartoons related to Jack Kirby. I believe Jack Kirby never had a job that gave him health insurance until he worked on the Thundar the Barbarian cartoons for Ruby Spears.
That's why so many of those classic comic guys wound up moving into film design or cartoons in the 70s and 80s, because they were treated much better than they were in the industry that they built. So,
but another thing about this, the Seven Little Superheroes thing, I was shocked to find out, like, oh yeah, this is just an Agatha Christie adaptation. Like, and then there was none. I did like that they build to that, and I think the most creative writing in it is just how Chameleon threatens them with the full poem that he reads as he kills all of them, or seemingly kills all of them.
Yeah.
But then they have to write the superheroes to be the stupidest idiots in the world to get to the conceit of that book, which is, oh, they're all trapped on a remote island together and slowly they're picked off one by one. And for it to work here, like Spider-Man has to get an anonymous note that says, hey, come to this island. Oh, sure, I will.
It's not written for people who are going to actually try to watch it with a rational or logical mindset, It's just about getting characters from point A to point B as quickly and cheaply as possible. So the second episode that you picked out, Along Came Spidey. It's second season, so it's a few episodes after Seven Little Superheroes, and it's the classic origin story.
Yeah. So the reason I picked this one was the second season of the series is just a trio of origin episodes for the three main characters. And what makes them stand out is that for the third season, they were able to get the animation production company Toei, who do a lot of anime, like they did Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon, all that. They did these three episodes, so it definitely looks better. I'm not even saying it's. I think this looks as good as the budget would allow on a 1982 cartoon.
Yeah.
So
and it does a solid job of telling that origin story as well. I mean, it hits all the beats you expect.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't cut out the Crusher Hogan wrestling aspect or any of the less essential parts of the origin.
Yeah, to watch it, I'm somebody who has Amazing Fantasy 15. I know it by heart. So to see the exact, like, oh, I know that exact panel. That's the exact word. Like when Spider-Man asks out Sally on a date and she blows him off to go and flash his hot rod. Like that is literally page 2 of the Amazing Fantasy 15. Just, I think, almost word for word.
No, it does. It is straight from the comic, pretty much. One thing that it really hammered home that I, picked up on in the first episode we watched, but because I'd only seen that one, I wasn't sure if it was a trend or not. Despite using Spider-Man villains, they really don't make any attempt to portray them the way they would have been done in the comics.
No.
Like the Shocker here is, I mean, he's some sort of boilerplate, like pretentious, arrogant villain speaking with grandiose language and stuff. Whereas I'm pretty sure in the comic he's supposed to be like a dude from Brooklyn or something.
Yeah, he's a guy's like, I use my super weapon to steal cars. That's what I do.
I punch people. Here he's like shooting, laser beams out of his fist and stuff.
Yeah, well, and they also have to. I mean, that's why I think he was a good pick by the writers for this episode, because there's like, he only appears in like 5 minutes of it. It's really about he's an accessory to Spider-Man's origin story. So Shocker's enough of a threat to cover that much time. Like in the video games, Shocker's like always your like a mid boss. You never work towards a Shocker battle in the Spider-Man video game.
The weirdest thing about this episode, and I don't know if you've thought this as well, so it ends with this ominous close-up on Aunt May as the sinister music plays. Like, watching that, I'm thinking, wait, are we supposed to wonder if she's actually the chameleon or a Skrull or something?
I can explain that, and it's this episode suffers from it the most in that, okay, so when this aired on network airings, they all had Stan Lee voiceover on it. So
okay.
Stan Lee would introduce and take you out of the episode, but for some reason in the versions that Disney has the rights to for seasons 1 and 2, there's no Stan Lee dialogue. So the scenes where, like how this episode begins with just a long tracking shot over to where Spider-Man is, or no, to the Shocker in jail, there should be Stan Lee saying like, how did Spider-Man come together and why is the Shocker such a threat? So you'll find out today, true believer.
So that answers my next question, because in the third episode, which is from the third season, the third episode that you and I watched, The Origin of the Spider Friends, Stan Lee does narrate this one. It's the only one of these three he narrates. And that's one of the things I did remember from the show, from the few times I saw it as a kid, is that Stan would narrate them. So this explains why he did not narrate those first two. And that's really weird that they don't have the rights to the narration.
Yeah, I'm glad they at least have it on, I think, all the third season episodes. This one, it really wouldn't work at all without it, because you need Stan Lee to just even set the scene that this is a flashback. But like when I found out this was the episode I had on VHS, and I figured, oh, this has to be the first episode, right? And it's way late in the series, which is why Stan Lee's like, you've all said that we never told you how they teamed up. Well, fine, here you go.
I mean, his narration, it totally has that bullpen bulletin Stan soapbox tone where he's like, you've been asking us for this, and don't say we don't ever give you the things you ask for, or that this isn't the great age of Marvel over explaining things, or it totally
love
feels
that.
like I'm reading what he's saying.
I miss Pitchman Stan so much. Like, I know obviously, Stan is overrated in some degrees as the co-creator of all these characters, when in some cases it's just he was the manager of a bunch of artists who he said, hey, make up everything about this. But I do think Stan Lee, as the pitchman of Marvel from the 60s onward, like, he got the people to the tent. Like, he was the ringmaster.
He's hard to respect, but even harder to dislike.
Yeah, he's so likable, like that, and he knew that. I mean, you feel bamboozled by him at a certain point, or you just there came. I actually got to go to like late in his life this Stan Lee appearance at a baseball game, like it was Marvel Day at the San Francisco Giants, and as he was being asked questions, I was there with a guest, and I just leaned over to the guest and was like, I know the exact story he's telling. He tells the story all the time. Here's the end of the story. And just boom, I knew it, because I've been hearing Stan Lee tell stories for my entire life.
Yeah, and it's all made up because he notoriously has like the worst memory of any man who's ever lived.
Yeah.
Or else he just uses that as a convenient excuse to not give people the credit they deserve. One of the two. I don't know.
And I also wanted to pick this one because it's so crazy to see Tony Stark like so different. This is again why I didn't like Iron Man as a kid. He was like my dad. He's just and also I just never, for some reason, it didn't bother me that Bruce Wayne was super rich, but the fact that Iron Man was like, well, he's an industrialist, that's lame. I want a hard scrabble guy who has trouble paying rent like Peter Parker.
Right. He's got this just absurdly deep baritone in this episode. Tony Stark. His voice is like so deep, like impossibly deep. I don't understand the choice made behind that.
Yeah, I mean, Spider-Man for the longest time never even sounded like a teenager either. Like I like the Spider-Man in this show all right, but he only started sounding like a young person in like 90s voice casting.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, he was always in his 20s by then, you know? Like
Yeah.
the teenage Peter Parker was in the 60s. By the end of the 60s, he was already in college, you know?
Yeah, one of their I if I could go back in time and change one thing, I would tell like about Spider-Man comic books. I would convince them like, please keep him in high school. Like you having him age in real time and be out of high school by like issue 34 or whatever. Like that is such a waste of storytelling opportunity.
Right. I do like that Marvel lets characters age, or that they used to let characters
For a
age.
time, yeah.
But they definitely did it a little too fast with Peter, because I mean, basically, like you said, they rushed him through high school. Then he was in college for like 15 years or something.
Yeah. No, and he had to
then
be like, "Oh, I'm a postgraduate student at Empire State University," which I did.
Yeah.
There is little stuff I like in this episode where it definitely feels like because this was a production not licensed to somebody, Marvel owned this company, that I do think they cared more about some details. They're like, well, yeah, he works for J. Jonah Jameson in the Daily Bugle. He goes to Empire State University. The X-Men are mentioned a bunch. Like, they are mutants. There's at least these core bedrock facts of the Marvel universe that they don't just gloss over for storytelling purposes.
Right. So mentioning the X-Men like you just did, and you said that second season were origin episodes for each character. The Iceman episode, do they call him a mutant? Do they mention the X-Men, all of that?
Well, yeah. So that's the behind-the-scenes secret of the third season and some of season 2 is that what Marvel really wanted to do, they did their Spider-Man shows, but they're like, okay, we did Spider-Man and they did a Hulk show. They wanted to do an X-Men show, but they felt that they knew the X-Men were popular with comic fans, but they didn't have the kind of Q rating that the Hulk and Spider-Man did. So the third season has, I think, 3 or 4 different episodes that feature the X-Men. Like the Firestar origin episode, it has, I think, the first time Wolverine appeared in anything animated, and he has a very stupid joke, but it took them 10 whole years, another decade, to finally get this X-Men animated series they wanted.
Yeah. I mean, to sort of give some frame of reference of the X-Men at the time, I was reading comics by 1983, 84. Very young. I was mostly reading the comics my older brothers would buy. And I was buying some of the toys that they would make, like the Marvel Secret Wars line, which I think was the first line of superhero toys I bought. And I remember that Wolverine was in that line. And although I knew Captain America, Spider-Man, Iron Man, all the bad guys, I did not really know who Wolverine was at that point in time when I was like 6 and I saw that toy. So although the X-Men was massively popular with comic readers, it definitely in the early 80s was not at the same level of public awareness as the older Marvel characters.
Yeah, it's crazy how much that changes in just a decade. Like, you could, I mean, Claremont, his run with all those great artists, like it just grew and grew from Byrne. Even though I'd say the Claremont Byrne run's the best, but he kept getting bigger and bigger superstar artists. But once it was Jim Lee, it's just like, and especially that X-Men show. They owe the 92 X-Men show, they owe Jim Lee money for character designs. They just took his pages and made those the characters.
Right. Yeah. But then you owe Chris Claremont basically all the characterizations.
Yeah. So. No, I mean, hey, everybody got screwed over. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So getting back to the origin of the Spider-Friends. So we learn about how these 3 specific characters meet. It's not very interesting. Bobby Drake, Iceman, is kind of like this sort of bully. They're sort of fighting a little bit over Firestar.
Yeah.
Another weird thing about it, I'm kind of rambling here, is the villain is the Beetle, who is not a Marvel villain that you see often outside of the comic books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's got this really weird, high-pitched voice that is very familiar because it's Chris Latta, a.k.a. Chris Collins, who also voiced Starscream and Cobra Commander a few years later. So we have like a proto Cobra Commander almost as the bad guy in this episode.
I 100% feel like after he did this for the same, I mean, not all the animation folks, but writers and voice cast and director all were on this show and then went to G.I. Joe like a year or two after. So I think it's totally believable that they're trying to come up with his voice for Cobra Commander, they're like, hey, remember the Beetle voice you did? Let's start there. Like, I think the Beetle's at least a good pick as a villain for the episode, since he started as a Spidey villain and then transitioned over to Iron Man because he's an armored guy. But
right.
But oh yeah, you did touch on the love triangle they tried to build here in the show. And there's a couple episodes written by Christy Marks, the woman who'd create Gem and the Holograms.
Yeah.
And in those, I think she deals with it a bit better, of like the competition between these two guys, and they both want to date her. But now I can't not view it with 2020 eyes, where these days canonically Bobby Drake is an openly gay man,
right.
and so I just see them as a polycule of people like that.
Do you think he was just deeply repressed at that point in time?
Oh, totally, yeah. That's my retcon for it, is that Iceman was, I mean, Angelica is a fellow X-Man, so he's like, oh, the girl I've known my whole life in high school, she's my girlfriend, and it ends up accidentally being a beard for him. Not intentionally, but another big design change they did with Bobby Drake was he's not blonde, but
no, I mean, it totally seemed like they had the Johnny Storm character model ready to go, and they're like, well, crap, we'll just make this guy blonde instead.
And also, because Peter's a brunette, it's like, well, we can't have just two brunette white guys here. Just make Iceman the blonde guy. Nobody knows what Iceman's non-ice form looks like anyway.
Speaking of the romance, like, there's not even, in the other two episodes we watched, there's not even any hint at any kind of romance between any of the characters. So over the larger scope of the series, like, are Iceman and Angelica, are they generally presented as a couple, or as him wanting to get with her, basically?
I think it is more presented that Iceman thinks he's her boyfriend and she doesn't, and like he'll go like, hey, she's with me, and then she'll say, I'm not with anybody. And yeah, I think that's usually how it comes out, if they even touch on it. But it's so light. Well, I mean, too, it just feels like Peter and her are a better couple anyway, because they very intentionally designed Angelica to look like Mary Jane.
She's basically John Romita's Mary Jane Watson Parker.
Yeah, in her super identity, especially she has the huge Romita senior hair, like, too. It's which there is no Mary Jane in this universe that they mention. It's pretty well. So this Amazing Friends show aired at the same time as syndicated Spider-Man solo show. So if you're wondering, like, where's all the Spider-Man supporting cast, they're in that show. They pretty much just limit it to Aunt May and occasional appearances by like JJJ, like in this episode.
So this episode, the origin of the Spider Friends, like we said, Tony Stark is a major part of it, and he has a weirdly deep voice. But also, they just have a total aside for no reason to mention to the fans, the viewers at home, oh yes, Tony Stark is actually Iron Man, but he's up in space and can't help out right now.
It's such a cheap out to just really, I mean, but that so is the spirit of, like, if you're reading like Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, Spider-Man like swings by the X-Men and they're on for one panel, and it's like, read the X-Men every month in this comic. Like, it feels like some classic just quick guest star to sell kids on another comic book.
Like, if there's ever a comic story where someone that's not Iron Man has to help Stark International, they would absolutely have the little editor's note to tell you why Iron Man is not there. So this did capture that feeling, you know?
Those always got me to, like, in my early days of, like, I'd read a Spider-Man comic and he'd say, like, why can't the Avengers help me? They're not answering their phone. Editor's note: the Avengers are in outer space fighting the Kree right now. Read it and blah blah blah. Like that. Those always got me, and especially when I started reading like the music books, like Marvel's that just patchwork sewed together all the history of it. Like, that made me realize how interconnected everything was.
That's another thing that I kind of missed when I got back into comics in the aughts. Although everything is so interconnected in the sense that there's just a constant ongoing crossover event, no matter what time of year it is, and every comic gets sucked into it. They no longer were as a company on top of making sure things lined up in a way that kind of made sense from book to book, or didn't have the little references like we were mentioning to let you know what comic you should read to see what they're referring to.
And did you notice that nobody can punch anybody? That's against the Saturday morning rules.
Right.
And even in the Spider-Man origin story, Uncle Ben has to die. That is a core part of the story. But how they kind of talk around, they're just like, your uncle, like they can't say it.
It's left unsaid. And, there's a bit of artistry to that. Mm-hmm. I was a little impressed by that, actually. I was wondering how they would deal with that being a Saturday morning cartoon in 1981 or whatever.
And as a kid, I didn't notice as much that Spider-Man didn't punch people. I think growing up for another moment for me was realizing, like, these Ninja Turtles never use their weapons on anything. They just right. they drop chandeliers on people with their swords. They don't actually like stab anybody.
So weirder than that, probably the weirdest single thing about this series, from what I can tell, is apparently in this version of the Marvel Universe, Iceman activates his powers by encasing himself in an entire block of ice.
Yes. Yeah.
And then smashing it.
It's so strange. And how he just does it in public, which is like, that's a very splashy way to go into your secret identity. It feels like that is them bowing to animation dealings of like, we need a reusable sequence, as many as we can find in the show. So can't they just transform in a way we can just replay a million times? The Spider-Man's is unexciting. It's just like he just puts down his mask. Like there's no real big transformation thing for Spidey.
Right. Well, I mean, that's he is who he is. It's 24/7. He's not living a double life like Bobby Drake at this point in time. So, as a Spider-Man fan, where would you rank this among the many different Spider-Man cartoons?
It's definitely, I would put it below the 94 show that I watched as a kid, even though that is like very poorly animated as well. I think it at least is better acted and better written. And I'd also put above it, like, the modern Spider-Man shows are at least better animated and, are written at least not completely underestimating a child's intelligence. But to me, there is something like quaint and sweet about the show to just from growing up, but also like it harkens back to a time before Marvel was this highly planned brand, and just this everything about like seeing the random characters that show up in the episodes like Cap and Doctor Strange. I'm just like, man, in the MCU, they'd have planned out this like a decade in advance, and they're just, I'd know all the deals behind the scenes for it. So I kind of, if you're going to watch any of the any cartoon that's over 30 years old from the Marvel section on Disney Plus, I think this is at least the most fun of them.
I enjoyed it more than I thought. And when I was saying earlier about how you can tell it's like a pre-grim and gritty superhero property, I like that. I mean, that's the kind of superhero stuff I grew up with, like 80s Marvel, where or especially later on 70s Marvel, which I didn't read until last decade, but before it got to be trying so hard to be serious all the time, but when it was still kind of being written for like, a teenager instead of like a 5-year-old or whatever. That is, I think, sort of the sweet spot for superhero comics for me, for my taste at least.
And there's something touching about like the very lame catchphrase of like, Spider friends, go for it. Like it's just so cornball. I do really like the confused way it ended up on Disney Plus, which is like, there were other Marvel cartoon shows that were produced by Hanna-Barbera that aren't on there because it's like shared ownership. It's like, how Fox owns the Adam West Batman, but they also can't release it without DC's permission, kind of thing. And in this case, though, through a winding bunch of purchases, like Disney, these cartoons, the Marvel Productions was bought by Saban when Marvel was going through its big bankruptcy thing. Saban then gets bought by Disney, so Disney owns these Marvel cartoons in the aughts, and then they buy Marvel outright, and so that's how they just own all of these cartoons.
So eventually, if they just keep buying everything, they will be able to add that Stanley narration back in.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's also why like this can be on here because they own all the X-Men stuff now, so they don't even have to worry about like, can we stream an X-Men cartoon? Fox might have the X-Men cartoon streaming rights. Like, and it's also why the best Spider-Man cartoon is not on here, the Spectacular Spider-Man show, because that was made by Sony, and so. It can't be on Disney Plus, at least until Disney buys Sony, which I mean, eventually, for sure.
At this point, I think Sony buying Disney is more likely, given how bad this year has knocked Disney for a loop.
You know what? You're right. It was I got to adjust that because for the longest time I thought, oh, Sony's in a bad place. I could see them wanting to sell off their media divisions for some money, but now it makes way more sense that Sony would be in the better place. Well, could you imagine Disney actually selling off like Marvel or Star Wars to somebody else? I just did imagine they just own it forever. Like once Disney has it, they're not going to sell it to somebody, but anything's possible right now, I guess.
One last question for you. You mentioned Spider Friends, how that's their catchphrase. Do they ever explain why Iceman and Firestar are totally okay with their group being named after this other guy who they actually didn't even know until after they'd already been friends for a long time?
Oh, in the origin Firestar, she explains it. She says like, well, since it was Spider-Man's idea we come together and he's been doing this longer than us, let's call ourselves the Spider Friends. So
I might not have been paying complete attention by that point watching that episode.
But I would definitely suggest watching more of this, at least one of the X-Men episodes, so you can see like the fumbling. If you listener are an X-Men fan, to just see the fumbling first attempts by Marvel to make an X-Men cartoon work.
I'm going to go check that out. So Henry Gilbert, thanks for coming by this show.
For sure. Thank you.
And, where can people find Talking Simpsons and What a Cartoon and all your other work?
Oh, sure. Well, follow me on Twitter at HENEREYG. I use it a whole lot. And yeah, Talking Simpsons is our weekly chronological exploration of every episode of The Simpsons. We're getting to the end of season 11 right now, and that's on every place you can find podcasts. And the same goes for the What a Cartoon podcast, where we cover a different animated series each week in the style of Simpsons. We did one of Amazing Friends as well. You guys should check out another Spider-Man ones if you like hearing me talk about Marvel comic books. And we, me and my co-host Bob Mackey, we are Patreon supported by listeners at patreon.com/Talking Simpsons, where we have a ton of exclusive content that you get for $5 or $10 a month if you're a subscriber. And so please check me out in all of those places.
Perfect. So season 11 of The Simpsons, was that like 2000, 2001 era?
It takes you up to May 2000. Yep. Yeah. The next season 12 that we're about to start working on, that is the last one before September 11th, which is a real marking of time for us on the show. We also just have to relive in the timeline. We do this thing at the start where we're just like, what happened the week this aired? And we are now getting into like, oh, the 2000 election. Yay.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks again for coming by. It's been great talking to you.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. This was awesome.
Okay, thanks for listening. This has been What the Plus. I'm Garrett Martin. We'll be back next week with another brand new episode talking about something on Disney Plus. Until then, have a great week.